Hi everybody, welcome to topic 18. This is the last topic of this semester, and we are going to talk about one of my favorite super topics in this course, partly because I have been involved in some of the work in naming species. First, we're going to delve into what a species is. We'll have a little bit of a debate, at least I will, behind the scenes. I want you to think about some of your ideas, and then we'll talk about the naming of species. So there will be 2 videos. This is the first of 2, and what we're going to be doing in this particular topic is addressing a couple of things that you should know. Some of it will be review, and so that might help. First, we'll talk about species formation. So how do species actually form in the first place? You've actually seen this before. Then we'll talk about major species concepts, which is basically how we define a species. So what is a species? Then we'll talk about whether species actually exist. We could have an entire class, an entire semester just on that topic. And this is still a topic that is pretty hot in terms of philosophical ideas. And there isn't really a lot of agreement, but we'll get into some of that. And then we'll talk about how species are named. That last part, the 4th topic, will be part of the second video. So the first 3 questions we will address very briefly in this topic video. So let's get started. First, we want to talk a little bit about species formation, and this should be mostly review for you, but I will talk you through the process. Species formation is also known as speciation. This is the process in which species form. And this isn't a process that humans can visualize because species formation occurs usually over millions of years, but we do have some evidence of species or variants or variations of species forming in shorter periods of time. So the general idea here is that new species form because of reproductive isolation and because of a lack of gene flow. If you remember back to Biology 161, which you took maybe a long time ago, gene flow is the movement of genetic material of genes from one population to the next. So the one thing that I want you to remember as we walk through species is you have to understand what a population is. A population is a group of individuals that live in the same area at the same time that we presume belong to the same species, whatever that might be, but it's a group of populations that are interbreeding, and if that population ends up getting split or divided, over time, there will be reproductive isolation. If you prevent individuals, or if a barrier prevents individuals from mating or moving back and forth, over time, those 2 populations or subpopulations will move apart. And over evolutionary time, they will build up their own mutations, their own behaviors, their own morphologies, and so on and so forth, which is how we recognize species today. So new species form because individuals are no longer interbreeding, and there is a lack of movement of genetic material across or between the 2 or more populations. Species formation can occur in 2 different ways. There are actually a couple of additional models that have been proposed. We will not talk about those. We're going to keep this fairly simple. And the first of those is allopatric speciation. Allo in Latin means different, and patric referring to the homeland. So if you think of patriotic, the term patriotic comes from that same root, meaning that you are bound to your homeland. Right? Allopatric speciation involves some kind of barrier or something different that causes a population to split in half so that those populations are then evolving on their own and eventually becoming a unique species or a set of species. Sympatric speciation we have witnessed in nature very few times. This is kind of a contentious example, but we do have evidence that it exists. And this is where species form, but where the species themselves are overlapping in their range, in their geographic range. And so the question might be, well, how can 2 species form when they're living in the same area? So sim meaning together, Patrick meaning homeland. The populations that we are talking about are living in the same area, so there has to be something else that happens that splits those populations in half, which should result in reproductive isolation and then a lack of gene flow. So let's talk a little bit about that. The first thing I'm going to do is use a slide that I used in the very beginning of this semester, where we talked about how populations or individuals eventually branch over time. You can go back to, I believe it was topic 4 of this semester, and you'll see these exact same pictures. So we're visualizing the speciation process, and this is fairly simplified, but if you imagine a population of ants, so these look like carpenter ants, okay? And that population, here we can view it over time, starting at the base. We've got a population of ants, and they're living together. And over time, there is some geographic barrier that begins to split these two populations in half. Now, that barrier might not be something physical. Oftentimes, it's something like a mountain range that begins to divide a population into half, into two subpopulations. It could be a river. So there is plenty of evidence that after glaciation, the last glaciation event, the Mississippi River formed because the water from the glaciers melted, and the Mississippi River divided populations of various groups of organisms, insects and other animals, especially vertebrate and plant groups, divided them into eastern and western portions. So the Mississippi River was actually that driving force that drove populations to divide and to become reproductively isolated. So you can either have a barrier like that forms over time, and of course it takes many, many years, thousands to millions of years, or you could have something happen where, if we look at this example on the slide, subpopulation 2, which eventually will become its own species, has moved away from population 1. So allopatric speciation does not have to involve a physical barrier, but it has to involve speciation that results due to the separation somehow of the one population into two or more. Sometimes we do get speciation in which you get a split between, or a split into not just 2 branches, but possibly 3. So this is the general idea behind speciation. Okay, eventually these ants in this example will no longer be breeding with one another. They will be reproductively isolated, and they will develop their own mutations, their own behaviors, their own mating behaviors, etc. over time, and thus we end up with 2 unique species. The one difficult thing here that you want to think about is, at what point do we call them separate species? And this goes back to the last topic where we talked about gene and species trees. Somewhere in between the 2 populations becoming distinct species, there might still be interbreeding going on. There might be introgression happening. And so where we make that cutoff of what a species is, that is where the problem lies. So this is just a simple example. Here we see, if we convert this into a cladogram or into a tree-like form, branching evolution has resulted due to reproductive isolation, and there is a split from a single population into 2 over time. A tree is an oversimplification of speciation because the tree makes it look like these 2 species just instantly split from one another, from some common ancestor or some common population. But we know that that takes a long, long time, and the period at which those 2 populations are definitely no longer interbreeding cannot be known, but they are now 2 separate species. These are 2 different squirrel species that have formed over time as the Colorado River carved what is now the Grand Canyon. So we have a species that lives on the north, rim of the Grand Canyon and a species that lives on the south rim. And those species, of course, were likely interbreeding. They were the same population at some point until those canyons became deep enough for the species to stop interbreeding. And there might be a preference on the two sides of the Grand Canyon for mates that look or act or behave similar to them. So that is where speciation occurs, and that is what allopatric speciation is all about. Now let's talk about sympatric speciation. Here we've got the quintessential sympatric speciation example on this slide, and a quick little story about Ragelitis pomonella, which is the name for the hawthorn or apple maggot fly. These flies, resembled by the picture on the right, historically have fed on hawthorn trees. There are several different hawthorn trees, probably at least 50 different species of hawthorns in the United States. Hawthorns are native to the US, and these little flies lay their eggs in these little hawthorn fruits. And what happened in the 1600s is Europeans brought apples over to the United States. What eventually happened is the flies that were feeding on and living on and mating in the hawthorn orchards or hawthorn trees eventually found a new host, which was the apple. So when the Europeans brought the apple to the United States, these flies had a different host that they could now live on, feed on, etc. And over time, what has happened is that Ragelitis pomonella species has diverged into what we now call two different races or forms of the Ragelitis pomonella species. We might consider them subspecies. There is about a 4 to 6% hybridization rate between these different flies, but what has happened over time is the two different races have become specialized on either hawthorn or apple trees. So the introduction of apples into northeastern North America has resulted in the shift, a host shift, of not all but some of the flies from hawthorns over to apples. All right, next we will talk about what a species is. So if you recall, going back to Biology 161, you probably did talk about this a little bit, but the ideas are quite mushy. They can get a little bit messy when you think about the details. And so I have this beautiful picture of two ants on this slide. And I want you to think about this question: what is a species? I would have said that these are perhaps two different species. Just look at the size difference. If I didn't know anything else about ants, I would say that these were two different species. These, in fact, are leafcutter ants. If you've ever been to Central or South America, leafcutter ants are native there. They can sometimes be a pest because they will defoliate an entire tree as they cut leaves off the tree, which they then feed to their fungus farms. And so in this picture, there are two different worker ants. One is small, one is large. This particular species of leafcutter ant has various different working classes, as well as a soldier class, and then a queen. The species as a whole is quite complex, but these two worker ant types or castes are doing different things. They play different roles in the colony. So we can talk a little bit about that in our chat, but do think about how difficult it is sometimes to come up with a definition for what a species is. Here we look at this picture of a bunch of dogs. Everybody loves dogs, and then there's a couple of critters here that don't belong. So we've got two cats, and we as humans can say, yes, dogs and cats are different species, right? Think about why you would say that. Why do you think dogs and cats are different species? And you can come up with several reasons for this. Dogs and cats look different. Dogs and cats behave different. Dogs and cats don't interbreed, right? These are a couple of different ideas that come to mind. But what makes all of these dogs that look so very different, what makes them the same species? And at what point do we call different dog breeds different species? If we compare dogs and cats, yes, they look different, but if we look across the different breeds, if we compare the large German Shepherd to the little Labrador, those look quite different. And so at what point do you decide what a different species is? And there really isn't an easy answer to that, but we'll talk about it a little bit. So there's some fundamental issues that have arisen in biology for the last several hundreds of years. And one of them that you should know is that there is general agreement that species exist. Species are a real thing in nature. But I will show you a couple of quotes that came out from Darwin and from some of his successors talking about, do species actually exist? Today we do agree that yes, species as natural beings do exist. Where there is disagreement, however, is on the species category, right? Linnaeus proposed this ranking, his Linnaean hierarchical classification system, where you get kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. But what is a species? Is there a definition for a species? That is where some of the problems come in when we're trying to identify what species are. So we know species exist. Humans have given them names. Those names are arbitrary and those are made up. But the species category as a whole, can that be defined? Ideally, there should be a standard definition for a species for all organisms, and this is where we still have debates. There are currently close to 30 different species concepts, which means we have 30 plus different ideas and definitions of what species are. Luckily, I will introduce you only to 3 of them. We'll talk about them very briefly, so please make sure that you know what these are. First, one of the original definitions for a species was provided by a man by the name of John Ray. He suggested that a species is basically a group of individuals that can breed together and produce fertile offspring. So if we look at, for example, a horse, a donkey, and a mule, horses are distinct species, donkeys are a distinct species, but what is a mule? Right? If horses and donkeys mate, they will produce a mule. And there are some exceptions to this rule, but mules tend to be sterile. They cannot produce their own offspring. And part of the reason for that is that the chromosomes in horses and donkeys don't match. Horses and donkeys don't have the same number of chromosomes. So when egg and sperm of horse and donkey come together, there is a mismatch. And so that mule then, what do we call a mule? What is a mule? A mule is essentially just a hybrid of a horse and a donkey. It is not its own species. So let's talk a little bit about the different species concepts. The one that you are most familiar with is the one that I just introduced, which is the one originally proposed by John Ray. And that definition has since been updated by a man by the name of Ernst Mayr. That should look very familiar to you. Who was Ernst Mayr? See if you can come up with the answer for that. Ernst Mayr came up with basically 2 different definitions that essentially say the same thing. First, species are groups of actually or potentially interbreeding natural populations which are reproductively isolated from other such groups. Or, a species is a reproductive community of populations reproductively isolated from others that occupies a specific niche in nature. So these are 2 different definitions, but they're essentially highlighting the biological species concept. So a biological species, again, is a group of organisms, of individuals living in the same population that are interbreeding or could interbreed and which are reproductively isolated from other such groups. There's a couple of problems with the biological species concept which have been highlighted for different groups. One is that since the biological species concept has to do with mating and reproduction, it really only applies to sexually reproducing species. And if we look at the little rotifer on the right, This particular group of rotifers, the Deloids, are all female. They essentially clone themselves. They do not require a male in order to produce offspring. In addition, evaluating what reproductive isolation is or how much separation is needed is difficult, because you could get species that interbreed and produce viable offspring. In the case of the mule, there are cases where mules can produce viable offspring due to chance. And so at some point, we have to make a cutoff somewhere of what we mean by reproductive isolation. And if we think back to how species form, this makes the question of when two species become different species, what is that cutoff point? How many individuals have to be interbreeding still in order for those species to be considered the same versus different? And then finally, there isn't really a way to apply the biological species concept to extinct populations or ancestral populations. It can only be applied to currently living organisms or current populations. We can't assess mating behavior in extinct dinosaur species. All we can use is really their physical features. Here's another concept that you might not have seen before, but this should mean something to you. This is the phylogenetic species concept. And there are several concepts that fit within the phylogenetic species concept, hence the phylogenetic species concepts. Okay, so this is called the PSC for short. And a phylogenetic species is defined as the smallest group or grouping of organisms that has undergone independent evolutionary change. So a phylogenetic species, as opposed to a biological species, is the smallest grouping of organisms that has undergone independent evolutionary change. And so here, if we want to use an example, a population, say a badger, right, that has evolved its own set of individual independent evolutionary features, whatever those might be, is considered a phylogenetic species. What we really get into the problem here with is when we're talking about interbreeding populations or subspecies. Subspecies tend to be able to breed with one another because they are part of the same species. So how do phylogenetic species concepts consider that information? We won't really get into that too much. One of the emphases here is that monophyly is important. Since we're talking about phylogenies, the way that this is applied here is that two different populations that are interbreeding and that are not distinct should be considered monophyletic as long as they share the same ancestor. They are an interbreeding or potentially interbreeding group of individuals. And so one thing that I want to make clear here is that the phylogenetic species concept, like many other concepts, actually takes into consideration reproductive isolation and reproductive ability in different organisms. So the biological species concept forms the foundation for many of the different species concepts. And then finally, like I just mentioned, the phylogenetic species concept doesn't really reference breeding per se. There is no mention in the definition about reproductive isolation, but it is assumed, right? If we look at these two different species on the slide, Canis latrans and Canis lupus, that would be the gray wolf, these two different species do not interbreed. They are unique. But they each are composed of a monophyletic grouping of populations that share a common ancestor. Canis lupus, the gray wolf, which we've talked about a couple of times, is composed of its own groups of populations that are located in different parts of the United States. And so a species is defined as a group of interbreeding populations. Here I wanted to put up the slide, which you might have seen if you've taken a class with me before. This is a group of 16 different butterflies, and so I have a question for you. How many species are here? And you can zoom in a little bit, take a peek at the different morphological features that you see here amongst these butterflies. These are actually skippers. Skippers are a specific group of lepidopterans, which is the order that contains all of our moths, butterflies, and the skippers. Skippers can be differentiated by the shape of their antennae. If you look really closely, their antennae are bent at the end. They have a little hook, like a little crochet hook, and that is what makes a skipper a skipper. So there are, in fact, 16 individuals on this slide, but they are all one species. So here we're going to talk a little bit about the morphological species concept. If we look at this group of skippers, there's one species, but look at all that morphological variation. So here again, the question becomes, where do you make the cutoff between what is one species and what is another? Which definition do you want to use? Here's another example. This is just a group of frogs that all belong to the same genus. In fact, they are all the same species. This is the genus species name, Ophaga pumilio. And these frogs are all capable of interbreeding, but they have different morphs. And so think about that again. If we are using the morphological species concept, which I will talk about next, at what point do you decide what a different species is? So we've got an example of the butterflies here where there's not a whole lot of variation. They look kind of similar. And then we've got something like this where these frogs look very distinctly different, but they're all the same species. Here we've got another example of a group of weevils that feed on root nodules. And there's about 100 different species of this particular weevil genus known to exist in the world. And what is shown here on this slide is the individuals on the left are going to be the females of each of the different species, and then individuals on the right tend to be the males. And here, if you look at these weevils, they look an awful lot similar. But there are at least 4 different species on this slide. So you compare this again, the weevils, to the frogs, and you start to ask, well, how the heck do you define a species? Let's get to the morphological species concept. Now, the picture on the top is cut off a little bit. These are the eastern and western meadowlark. The morphological species concept today is considered by many to be the outdated species concept. This is where we use morphology as a way to distinguish between species. So the morphological species concept is defined as, or can be defined as, a group of individuals or a species that is morphologically distinct from another species. The morphological species concept, if you think about it, is Linnaean in origin, or even goes back before Linnaeus, where when we go back to the original foundings of classification of organisms, we were using morphology to distinguish between species. But there's a big problem, because if you look at different species, like we just looked at the eastern and western meadowlark that appear, and their heads are cut off on this slide, they look very similar, yet they are called different species, and they don't interbreed as far as we know. And then we have humans. Look at how different humans look, and yet they are all considered the same species. So in some cases, we've got organisms that look very similar, but they're different species. And at the same time, we've got organisms of a population that look distinctly different, but they're the same species, like dog breeds. So what I wanted to get across here is that between just these 3 species concepts, making a cutoff between different species can be quite difficult. But the most problematic of the species concepts is definitely the morphological species concept. I have a question on here, is it really outdated? The reason that I posed that question is because for many species, all the information we have is their morphology. We don't know their behavior. We haven't assessed their reproductive behavior. We don't know which populations are interbreeding with which populations because we don't have people that are doing that all the time. We don't have enough field biologists that are studying those things. Couple of problems. First, you have to be really knowledgeable about the group of organisms you're working on to be able to use the morphological species concept. So someone who studies these frogs, they're going to know that these frogs belong to the same species because they might have witnessed interbreeding. They might have seen these different populations of frogs occur in different places, and they're going to have some additional biological information. The biggest problem is that variation in one group of organisms is not partitioned in nature like variation in another group. So if we look at variation in the frogs, for example, there's a lot of variation in color and in whether they have speckling, right? Different physical features like that in frogs are very different from the features that you might use for beetles. And so using morphology is both taxon specific, so it's very difficult to define a morphological species, and the beetles on the left all look very similar, yet they are different species, whereas the frogs on the right all look very different, but they belong to the same species. So think about this a little bit. It provides a good foundation for discussion. So I wanted to go through really quickly just a couple of different species concepts with you. Here is a bunch of them listed. No, you do not have to know these, but I did want to point out that this idea of how we describe and define species is a contentious issue, and it's existed for many, many decades. So here's a whole list of them. There's also a categorized list of species concepts, which we will not talk about, but they appear on the slide, and I just wanted to show you what some of these are. We can talk about some of them in our chat. And then I wanted to quickly walk through at the very end here a couple of different philosophical ideas that have been brought up. Here's a quote. This is from a letter that Charles Darwin wrote to a man by the name of Hooker in 1856. I have just been comparing definitions of species and stating briefly how systemic naturalists, these are systematists by the way, work out their subject. It is really laughable to see what different ideas are prominent in various naturalists' minds when they speak of species. In some, resemblance is everything, and dissent of little weight. So here Darwin is talking about how some naturalists think more in terms of the morphological species concept, and others are considering maybe more of a phylogenetic approach. In some, resemblance seems to go for nothing, and creation the reigning idea. In some, sterility an unfailing test, with others not worth a farthing. So they don't even mention it. It all comes, I believe, from trying to define the undefinable. So read this quote to yourself. In this letter that Darwin wrote, Darwin himself struggled with the idea of what a species is. He suggested that we are trying to define the undefinable. Here are a couple more quotes. From these remarks, it will be seen that I look at the term species as one arbitrarily given for the sake of convenience to a set of individuals closely resembling each other. So that would be the morphological species concept come into play. We shall have to treat species in the same manner as those naturalists treat genera, who admit that genera are merely artificial combination made for convenience. Genera, remember, is plural for a genus, so Darwin is arguing that species are really just arbitrary groups of organisms, and that our species really might be, as a group or as a rank, undefinable. Interesting. Here's another quote by David Hull in 1992, much later than Darwin. The only basis for a natural classification is evolutionary theory, but according to evolutionary theory, species developed gradually, changing into one another, or changing one into another. If species evolved so gradually, they cannot be delimited by means of a single property or set of properties. If species can't be so delimited, then species names can't be defined in a classic manner, and then they can't be defined at all. If they can't be defined at all, then species can't be real. If species aren't real, then species has no reference and classification is completely arbitrary. So this quote by David Hull basically throws out all of taxonomy and classification as a valid scientific field. A little bit far-fetched, but he's got some good points. At what point do we call a species if species are constantly evolving? If there is no identity for a species, if we cannot define it, then that brings up a couple of different issues. What do we make then of claims that say they've discovered a new species? We discover new species all the time. What does that mean then? Are we discovering new species and doesn't matter? What do we make of claims that a species is endangered? So going back to our last topic on conservation, if we can't define a species, how are we going to make decisions about rankings of these species? And how do we focus our conservation efforts? Finally, how do we apply endangered species legislation? How do we protect a species if we can't even come up with a definition for one? Think about these things. These are highly philosophical questions. There are a lot of scientific bases for these questions, and there have been hundreds of papers published, but I did want to put some of these bugs in your ears so that you can think a little bit about how they apply to what you're doing in your work, maybe in the future as a biologist or whatever you end up doing. So I will see you all for the next video where we will talk about some of the mechanics behind naming species. So we're going to assume that, yes, we know what a species is. We might not have a good definition for one, but we're going to move on forward and think about how we name a species. So hope you all enjoyed. We will see each other soon. On to the next video. See you soon.